I want to begin by saying this title, AI and Us. We went with this sort of expansive title to sort of give us as much space as we need to talk about all that's going on. We're not going to talk about all that's going on, don't worry. We'll talk about some of it. And one place to begin here, I think, is just to say that AI is this thing that's invoked as this sort of magic thing, this thing that's out there, this monster on a mountain that's going to save us or kill us or eat us or do any number of different things. And that conversation has become the thing around which we talk about so many things. The future of politics has become this sort of master narrative. And one thing I'm hoping we can do here is to kind of unpack what we mean by this thing, AI, which is in no way as kind of unitary or single as it's often evoked. It's many different tools, many different algorithms, many different ways of sort of using and engaging technology. So we're going to do that. As Kate sort of brilliantly puts it, right, artificial intelligence is in many ways not artificial and not terribly intelligent. So we're going to talk about why and how that is. And as we do so, I want to just begin by saying, let's take a deep breath. I sort of think of this night, actually, this is how we've sort of conceived of this night. If you haven't noticed, you've all noticed, there's a lot going on right now out in the world. It's a bit crazy making to sort of look at the news. And a lot of that news involves these technologies we're going to be talking about. But it feels so important, as I say, to just take a deep breath, take a pause, and think about the ways in which AI, or these things, the AIs, I should say, right, is not magic. It's material, it's human, it's something we made that we need to figure out how to engage with and understand and think about. And Ruha and Kate are here to help us think about how to do that. We're going to start by asking you, Ruha, who graced us with this image of the mighty Uhura from Star Trek. I want to ask you, because I know that you've described yourself actually as a student of Octavia Butler, as someone who's been really important to your thinking and your work as a scholar around technology, around race, around any number of things that you've done brilliant work around. And I wonder if you could just begin by speaking to how you came to your work as a scholar, thinking about technology in particular, thinking about difference, thinking about the future, thinking about imagination, and what Octavia Butler and or other figures of eminence have done to help you on that path.
How much time you got?
Yeah, let's get into it.
So there are so many origin stories to choose from, so I'll just be disciplined and choose one related to this image. When I was 15, my family moved from South Carolina to the South Pacific. And this was the mid-90s, and my main form of entertainment were boxes and boxes and boxes of my dad's recorded Star Trek episodes. So I had no choice. And so this was my sort of download into this realm of speculation and world building. And at the same time, I was, again, living in the Marshall Islands, the South Pacific. For those who may know, that was the testing ground for the bombs that our country has created. And it was also a place where I was befriending Marshallese who were taking me around and to different islands beyond the capital. And there were two sets of islands that we visited early on. One was the military installation, Kwajalein. And we took a ferry from Kwajalein. And Kwajalein, if you just landed there, you wouldn't think you were in the Pacific. It was like any suburbia environment. It was like Stepford Wives meets like the Truman Show. People walking around with strollers, lots of golf courses, Baskin-Robbins, no sense that you're in the Pacific. Short ferry ride. Next to that was Ibai, which is where Marshallese were pushed off of Kwajalein to live. It's nicknamed the ghetto of the Pacific. Shanty town, high 26 times the TB rate of the US, and many people still affected by radiation fallout. So it was this juxtaposition of this seeming utopia that had been created, this military utopia next to this dystopia, side by side. It was kind of my first glimpse that utopias need dystopias. You can't have one without the other, right? And so it was really this formation that then got me later, in my 20s and then 30s, really shaping my research to always look for the hidden dystopias beneath the utopias that were being sold. And so that looked like biotechnologies for my dissertation, regenerative medicine, looking at who and what is harmed in the process, to fast forward to today, to thinking about these AI futures that were being sold and the dystopias that are often out of sight. And so coming back to this image, part of what it evokes for me is a question of who is driving this ship? Who is shaping our collective future? Because as it stands, it's really a small sliver of humanity that's currently imposing its vision, its imagination on the rest of us. One way to think about it is that we're living inside someone else's imagination. And so I think for me, it's not just about changing the captain, who the demographics are. A lot of people will be presented with these problems, these tech-mediated harms and inequalities, and they'll say, oh, maybe if we just get more Black folks in tech, more Latinx folks in tech, change the captain, change who's behind the screens. And in my view, it's not even that it's not enough. It's, in fact, a really dangerous cosmetic fix for what it requires much more substantive redress. It's not that we shouldn't aim for that, but we shouldn't get fooled to thinking that that is going to magically change what we're getting downstream by changing who's upstream. And so I want us to think about what the values are, the ideologies, the assumptions, the desires that are getting encoded into the digital worlds that all of us have to inhabit. And the last thing I'll just say is, for now, is that I think these issues are too important to leave it to those who simply have the technical expertise, the technical know-how, right? It's an invitation for us to think about the many kinds of knowledges and experiences that we need around the table to move us forward, to drive this ship that we're in.
Indeed, thank you. And what you're saying there makes me think about the ways in which, again, the key insight that these technologies are not neutral. They're not, quote, objective, right? There's a sort of rhetorical move that's often made about, oh no, it's just math, it's just algorithms. And one thing that your work has helped us see, right, is the ways in which the values, the biases of the data sets that are used to train these models are embedded within them, which is to say that they're predicated on the world as it is in all its inequities, right? And so we'll get into this much more, but love that as a way in and a segue to your work, Kate. And one of the things that you've done for us as a researcher and as an artist, and I'm going to ask you to talk about this remarkable work that we're going to kind of scan over here, Calculating Empires, is to remind us that AI, as you say, as I said earlier, not only is it not necessarily artificial or terribly intelligent, but in vital ways it's material, right? And it's embodied. It's a real thing that has impacts and infrastructure that's growing at alarming and extraordinary rates, which you're going to tell us about. But this project, I wonder if you could talk us through this, about thinking about, the last couple of years, basically since ChatGPT showed up, there's AI, that's the new thing out of Silicon Valley. But of course, there's been lots of new things, and this is a kind of map of technology. Talk to us about this project and why it's important to think about technology as empire.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Josh. But I want to start by just acknowledging where we are. We are in an extraordinary crisis. In the last week, we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars cut away from researchers across universities in the country. We've seen Mahmoud Khalid arrested by ICE officers for attending a protest. And just today, we saw a Yale scholar suspended from her job for speaking at a Gaza protest. At the same time, AI is being used to scan all of our social media profiles to see if we talk about unacceptable terms. It's being used to scan through federal grants to see if you are working on diversity, equity, inclusion, climate, the female body, structuralism, you name it. There's a long list, we've all seen it. This is an appalling restructuring of power, and it is being done by a very small group of men who are also the richest men on the planet. And this is really what a tech oligarchy looks like when it stages a soft takeover of a major world government. And we are living through this right now. So part of what I'm really interested in doing as somebody who's been researching AI for 15 or so years is seeing this increasing centralization of power and feeling incredibly worried that this was something that nobody was stopping. Every single political party has been pushing this barrow further. So one of the things that really struck me was, how do we give this moment more historical depth? How do we look at how these types of centralizations of power have happened, not just now, not just in the 20th century, but over the last 5 centuries? And so working with my amazing collaborator, Vlad Anjola, over 4 years, we basically hand illustrated a map of 5 centuries, starting with the emergence of merchant shipping and the sort of emergence of colonization through the technology of long-range shipping, through to all of these forms of technology that initially start as effectively forms of excitement. You could think about the camera, radio spectrum, and then you gradually see these enclosures, how it's captured by particular interests. You see this again in the Enclosure Acts in the UK in the 1500s and 1600s, the capturing of what was land for peasants, and it becomes privately owned. This is the echo of time over centuries. And by doing this, my hope is that we can see how this is a period of the consolidation of empire, of technological empire. And this is what we have to fight.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that clarity and sort of bringing us to this moment, this urgent moment, this moment of emergency and of crisis. And I think one thing I was thinking about as you were talking about the enclosure of the commons is that we often talk about sort of data, and we're going to get into data quite a bit here, and privacy. And of course, there's a key aspect of sort of thinking about, we like to keep our data private. There's a way in which intuitively that makes sense. But one of the things that's going on, and as the videos that you all saw as you were sort of walking in, which is drone shots by our brilliant friend John Fitzgerald and Nick Fitzhugh put together this work, is essentially turning the commons into data and turning the world into data and sort of getting rid of this assumption that perhaps there should be stuff that is not owned or privatized or turned into data. And that seems to be a key aspect of where we are, fair to say.
I mean, it is extraordinary. We have seen the capture of everything that has been digitized into privatized structures. That is one of the biggest enclosures that will happen in our lifetimes. But as we know, it's just the beginning. It's the beginning of a set of further enclosures that we're now seeing, again, acquitted by the handmaidens of capital in now the US administration. So, I mean, I think this is the issue when we talk about AI. There's such a tendency to think of it as a set of abstract technological processes or algorithms. But it's really about the people behind it, the structures of capital behind it, and then these processes by which these systems are impacting our world, impacting humans, impacting our political institutions, and impacting our environment. So how do we make that the conversation around AI rather than the shiny new thing which we're constantly being told about?
Right, indeed. And one thing your work has done also, right, is just to think about those immense, and to reveal those immense amounts of capital. A couple of years ago, there's among the sort of finance and investment types, there was this riff, AI is so expensive. We need it, it's crazy data centers, it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And now they're spending it, and that infrastructure is coming to be, right?
$500 billion in the next 5 years.
This is not a small sum of money. No, they're spending that money. And by way of sort of helping us, I think about, or sort of pivoting to, again, the sort of definitional question, what is AI? As we've said, it's much better to put it in sort of plural terms or talk about machine learning. But Ruha, I wonder if you could just help us think about the ways in which you unpack this phrase, artificial intelligence, which is perhaps a way to ask what we mean by intelligence generally.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways we could call it like AI as an empty signifier, is a fancy way of saying that it becomes whatever we make it, right? It's deployed in so many ways. It's a marketing term. You know, it's certainly connected and wrapped up in these webs of corporate power. And so for me, I personally am sick of using the definition and the assumptions, as you say, like the technologies, and assuming that that's what we're talking about. And so I've been playing around with other ways to think about AI. What else can it be? Not this artificial intelligence, but what other forms of know-how and knowledge do we actually need to guide this ship to move forward? And so ancestral intelligence is one, and there I'm thinking about the kind of collective wisdom that we inherit, that we pass down, that often gets discarded as backward and primitive and no longer needed. And then abundant imagination as another kind of AI, which we'll talk more about. But partly what I want us to do is when those two letters are invoked, to ask, which one are you talking about, right? Like, not assuming that we're talking about the tech-mediated one that we're being sold, but what other kinds of AI do we actually need? Do we want to actually foster and grow and invest in and imagine? And so again, if ancestral intelligence is what we inherit, then in my view, abundant imagination is what we need to pass down. We need to radically expand how we think, what we think we need to know. You know, so much of AI, the first kind, the tech-mediated kind, is about closing off futures, about predicting things, about control, about scanning our social media and labeling people a terrorist. And so if that sort of controlling impulse is so tied into this first kind, then I think we need other imaginaries, we need other things to open up. And for me, these two options are to get us started in our brainstorm, in our discourse. And again, we can unpack what this might be, but I think we have to reclaim our power, not just to name reality, but to shape it. We can't work with something if we don't have language for it. Language is a technology, right? And so being able to put a name to something, we can start to work with it collectively and figure out a way to reclaim our agency rather than this top-down vision of the world that we're being handed.
Right. And one of the ways in which intelligence is defined, or certainly in sort of tech circles, is, you know, intelligence is about rational action, it's about decision-making. But as someone, you know, wisely said, you know, a good prediction isn't necessarily a good decision at all. These are very different things. And I think that, yeah, one thing we can sort of talk about here is this shift, right, that you just invoked from predictive AI to generative AI, which has been massive and has been, you know, now I think lay people often say AI, they mean generative AI in a sense. They mean, oh, a machine's going to write a song, or I can ask ChatGPT a question, and we'll see what comes back. And they do some impressive things. But this sort of shift, it seems to me, and Kate, you can tell me if this is correct, but yeah, essentially over the last couple of years, as sort of generative AI has taken off in sort of popularity and sort of, oh, this is the future, for better or worse. There's this sort of vision. And we're going to talk about predictive AI more here. But as generative AI has kicked off, it's changed the geography and infrastructure of this technology that you've urged us to think about, yeah, not as this mystical thing on the cloud, although it is a so-called cloud, but something that lives in minds and in tech centers and in towns that has a geography, right? I'm a geographer, as Jana mentioned, so I love your Alice stuff, just in principle. But talk to us about this visualization, this anatomy of an AI, which is a kind of another map, and the work you've been doing about this lived geography, this extant thing.
Yeah, it's a delight to have a geographer with us
Map
on
nerds
stage.
unite,
Yeah, map nerds, let's go. So this work, again, this was Vladan and I, this is before Calculating Empires, this is the precursor. So if Calculating Empires is a story about power and technology over centuries of time, this is about power and technology over space. So we've moved from time to space, and this one really came about back in 2016, where a lot of the conversation around sort of building what was then much more about predictive AI was looking at the sort of data and technology pipeline, what you kind of see there in the middle. And then we started sort of going, well, this doesn't tell you anything about, you see this beige container of an Amazon Echo, like it looks like it doesn't really do anything. It's barely creating a physical imprint. So instead, we opened it up, we looked what was in it, we found where the components come from, where they're mined, where they're extracted, how much the miners are paid, what their health conditions are, and then all the way through to the end of life of the devices where they get thrown out, generally after about 3 to 4 years, into e-waste tips in Ghana and Pakistan, where they poison waterways and the soil, and cause this kind of horrifying whole of life cycle. And this, for me, this changed me as a scholar. I mean, I think really before this time, I was used to going to archives, sitting at my desk, reading papers. This put me in the world in a very different place. And it meant that I would now, spend the next, 8 years in mines, going inside factories, going to data centers, speaking to people who were labeling data sets or, extracting lithium. And for me, those material landscapes are what is the real story of AI right now. And it's extraordinary. In 3 years, we've seen basically the creation of the largest, most expensive planetary infrastructure that we have ever built as a species. It is wild. I mean, basically the new Trump Project Stargate is unleashing not just a vast amount of capital, but capturing a huge amount of land for hyperscale data centers for generative AI that use enormous amounts of energy and water, and it's coming from those communities. For example, in Virginia right now, data centers use, I think it's over 20% of the state's energy. They're predicted by 2030 to be using 50% of the state's energy. So times that across the country in this huge rollout that we're seeing, you're looking at AI systems competing directly with humans for land, energy, water, basic resources of life. That is the real story that we're seeing with generative AI.
Indeed. And making this material, making it a material history, making it a geography, making it a human story, right? This is what this work of mapping has done. And we were talking beforehand about one of the things you've been looking at, right? These lithium mines, but you've been hanging out in North Carolina looking at sand too.
Yeah,
is this right?
yeah. It's taken a turn. So in the last 6 months, I've been spending time in this, basically the only mine in the world that is used to produce ultra-pure quartz. It's really fine sand that is essential to making semiconductors. And it's extraordinary that there is one place in the world where this is coming from, and it's in North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains. And so I started going there, speaking to people, studying the mines, got into a little 4-seater plane, and we flew over the mines to sort of see how it cuts into the landscape. And then a few days after we had arrived, and this was like on one of our trips, Hurricane Helene hit and wiped out the town. It was under 12 feet of mud. Over 200 people died in the region. It was catastrophic. It was climate change in the most vivid way. They never get hurricanes in this part of the mountains. And so for me, it was this kind of extraordinary experience of being in the story of the impacts of AI on our ecologies, on our atmosphere, on our climate, and then living through the horror of it. And then trying to record that and trying to just understand how this is going to repeat and accelerate if we don't acknowledge what's happening and start to actually address it. And this is the real mission of how do we do that?
Right, and making these stories real and grounded in the most real and urgent ways, right? And it's such an interesting thought experiment if you think about how do we picture AI. Yeah. And we had fun this past week talking with our wonderful designers about we did this little GIF of the mouse, which was sort of fun and cute, I hope. But one thing we were thinking about, is sort of how do you lend it an image, right? And some people might just think, oh, it's an iPhone, it's a weird face, it's some weird futurist image. But it changes things. If you say, no, it's a data center a mile across, right? Exactly. It's a catastrophic storm. It's a mine that's devastating an ecology. Right, and that's an amazing
I would say
shift.
that minimalism, the mouse, and the other minimalist aspects are part of the subterfuge, part of tricking us into looking away from the vast materiality of it.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. And so this is, Kate, your artwork has been sort of trying to give us new images for thinking about this. But I wonder if we could pivot a little to thinking about predictive AI, which you both have worked a great deal on. And obviously this technology is changing all the time, and this invokes, again, the images we were looking at before the talk here. And this essentially raises these questions about recognition. What is it to teach a machine to recognize? What do we mean by that? What's the data that's sort of teaching that algorithm to, if not see, then to recognize? And Ruha, a lot of your work has been looking in a very fine-grained and detailed way at the ways in which, again, inequities and biases that are baked into our society have become a part of many of these predictive AI systems. I wonder if you could talk a little about that work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we started where we did. First of all, I came here to listen to Kate, so I don't know what y'all are doing. I've been following her around, like, okay, so I'm glad we started there, though, because that's often what gets lost when we jump to this. We can think about this as the kind of impacts of AI on people, on communities, who's seen, who's not seen, who's surveilled, et cetera. But what we really have to do always is start the story and the conversation much earlier, which are not about the impacts, but the inputs. The material inputs, the ideological inputs, the social, historical, all of the things that happen that we take as given. When we start with the technology and its impacts, we assume that all of that is not up for debate. And so, which brings us to, this juxtaposition, which, again, we often are focused on one side of this, which is the being excluded part, when we're not seen by these tools. That often takes up a lot of space in our own sort of conversations and critique of technology. And what I really would love us to do, again, in terms of expanding how we think and talk, is not to only focus on the exclusion, because then the demand becomes inclusion, right? Without really questioning what we're being included into. And so that's why it's so important to think about all of the harmful ways that we can be centered by these technologies and these systems, and rather the people wielding them. And so really being watched but not seen is that left side of the screen. And so to think about hypervisibility and invisibility as two sides of the same coin, and it leads us down a very different rabbit hole when we start to thinking about what it means to be included into harmful systems, right? Then we have to move beyond the buzzwords and the demands for inclusion and even for diversity, right? Because we have to remember that all kinds of things are diverse that aren't liberatory, right? Plantations, colonies, Amazon factories, warehouses. And so, again, moving beyond the buzzwords leads us to open up the black boxes and thinking about, what it is happening behind the scenes. And so I really, again, thinking about expanding where we start and then where it leads us in terms of the conversation.
Right. And one of the things I think that leads us to is the distinction between recognition and construction, right? Or the ways in which an algorithm could sort of could correlate data and think about, I recognize this or recognize that, and not recognize the ways in which recognition is a part of constructing race, constructing gender, constructing the ways in which we have categorized the world for a long time in very harmful ways, right? And that these predictive AIs play a part not merely in seeing, but in constructing. Fair to say. Well, there we go. A similar image, Kate. This comes from a project of yours, ImageNet Roulette. We have Obama there as a demagogue. We have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as a state trooper, which I kind of love.
And Biden is an incurable, you'll see.
Oh, poor Joe.
And Hillary Clinton gets sick person, diseased person, yeah.
Poor Hillary. talk to us about ImageNet Roulette.
Yeah.
This is part of your art practice. Go on.
Well, this is a really good example of things that are very much bridging research and art. So this was a project with artist Trevor Pagland. We started this back in 2017, where
There's
don't
Kate
put that
and
up. No, Josh, put it away. Put it away.
I like that blue
as
jacket.
You can see, yeah, it's a good one.
There we go.
Yeah, we don't need that.
I'm trying.
Anyhow, so what we were doing, I had been spending several years looking at the big training data sets that we use to make AI systems see the world. How do they see? What is the basis of recognition? And the big daddy of visual AI systems is this data set called ImageNet. It was first basically released in 2009, had been openly on the web for the better part of 8 years by the time we were really looking at it in detail. It's got 14 million images, which are categorized into around 22,000 categories. So we started physically looking at the categories and the images, which very few engineers do. It's an infrastructure. You pull it off the shelf, you apply it, And we saw extraordinary things. People being labeled in, the worst types of categories, from things that were kind of obvious, like, okay, this person is a nurse because they're wearing a uniform, through to this person is a kleptomaniac or a crime suspect or an Eskimo, and all of these extraordinary racial, gender, a slut was in there, and it just keeps going and going and going. It's horrifying categorizations of just people who had their images online, And so then we trained a very simple neural net to basically apply those existing categories to people. We released it both as an art piece, but also as an app that you could use. And we didn't expect that a whole lot of people would start using it. And so we got up to 1 million people using it a day, where we had to say, and we're shutting this down because we can't afford the service cycles.
People got into the image.
People got into it. But you can see immediately the image logic. You can understand these sort of systems of classification. If I'm wearing a suit, I get categorized as a newsreader. If I'm wearing a bikini, I'll get categorized as a slut. It's the most basic, deeply stereotyped form of looking at people. But it is an object lesson in what happens when you classify people as objects. And so this was very much the work that we did for this show called Training Humans, where we looked at the material of data, how data is understood, how it's applied. And of course, this has now really exploded, so that training data sets now have 12 to 14 billion images. Even to look at those images now is it's a different project than when I started doing this a decade ago. You have to train an AI to look at the data set that's being used to train AI. It's that cumbersome now.
Right. And these neural nets, one of the things, I'm by no means a computer scientist or a technologist, but it's fascinating to just read them and sort of look at the ways in which people articulate how they work, or they attempt to articulate how they work, that neural nets, and as you have put it, that AIs are essentially probabilistic statistics at scale, right? And the mechanics of that, again, above my pay grade, but it's remarkable to think about sort of, again, what is the data that they're being trained on? How can we understand that data? And Ruha, you have do work in the Just Data lab at Princeton. I wonder if you could talk about that work and sort of thinking about, as came up earlier, this is not necessarily just a question about privacy, but about the ways in which everything being turned into data, and how we should understand that process and perhaps think about shaping it.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, are any of my students in here from the Just Data Lab? Yay!
There we go. Welcome.
So it's actually named the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. And that also sort of primes you to think about the fact that the conversations, the movements that we're trying to engender now are part of a much, much longer freedom struggle. They take a different iteration now, the kinds of harms and oppressions that are being mediated by AI. But again, it's important to trace these continuities. And I think in naming it after Wells, again, it's a reminder that she was wielding statistics and stories in order to combat terrorism in this country, lynching, traveling around the world using journalism and writing, but also data, to try to marshal facts about what was behind this racial terrorism. And so I think recognizing that all data, by definition, is historic, right? So that already brings the us into the conversation. And so here again, you see two images, one that evokes a prior era of racial domination on your left in terms of injustice in education. And then on your right, you have an image from the first few weeks of the pandemic, when students were sent home, they couldn't take their tests, all those important tests, the US SATs, but in the UK, where this image comes from, A-level exams are the corollary, really important for what university you can apply and be competitive for. And so what the UK government decided to do was use an algorithm to predict their grades. Predictably.
Right.
Students that went to more working class schools, diverse schools, their grades were predicted as lower than their wealthier, whiter counterparts. And so they took to the streets, as they should. And one of the signs, you saw the first sign, I think, fuck the algorithm, which is like in a nutshell. But this sign is really instructive because she's making a connection between those grades, those predicted scores, and the postal codes that students live in. And I think this is important because it's a reminder that this algorithm is not creating the problem from scratch. It's reflecting and reproducing existing forms of inequity encoded in the geography of the city and coded in the geography of the nation. So again, we can't just fixate on the technology and it's causing all these problems when there were all kinds of oppressions and injustices and inequities that predated this algorithm. So one, upside in my view of centering AI occasionally is that it has the potential to make us face things that we normally choose to ignore, right? It makes it clear that these inequalities exist, whether we act on it like the UK government and dole out scores, or we use it as grounds to contest the underlying inequality and oppressions. And that's the direction I see those students in the UK and these students here, my students in the audience, that are using their collective power as students to push back against these corporations that are developing and deploying these surveillance tools, these predictive tools, whether it's in education, healthcare, policing, borders, you name it. And so I think, part of it, my sort of mission, my soapbox, is for us to always get back to our power, not to allow the immensity of the problems that we're up against to completely overwhelm us to the extent that we paralyze. And so I offer this image again for students who, within the hierarchy, the feudal hierarchy of the university, are lowest on the totem pole, perhaps a little above staff. But really, when we organize and collect that power, then there's a potential, in this case, refusing to even apply for jobs at certain companies, essentially withholding your labor beforehand. And we see in union drives and other tech companies, again, thinking about these are the people that see these tools being developed before any of us are affected by them. And so if there are not protections in place that allow them to blow the whistle, that allow them to speak up, then we are going to feel the downstream results. And so that's why the labor issues and protections that are happening behind closed doors within these companies are directly tied to the harms the public then faces. And so, again, sort of circling that back and really thinking about what's happening upstream as grounds for this larger tech justice movement that we've inherited from the likes of Wells, Du Bois, and many others.
Right. And thinking about, I think one thing that we can sort of pivot to here around
Twitter, remember that?
I know, oh right. Kate said, I don't want to see my angry COVID tweets.
I don't want to see my old tweets.
I'm sorry, we'll go very quickly over your old angry Twitter
gosh.
tweets. your COVID
You
tweets.
dug this up.
I know, We did our research here at Pioneer Works. Anyway, this is you riffing on this ludicrous attempt to sort of categorize facial expressions into 7 universal emotions. Didn't work out too well.
But they're still doing it. They're still trying.
They're still going for it. Here's you talking about ChatGPT getting your bio and achievements all wrong.
Well, actually, it was they sicked Lex Friedman onto me because a journalist contacted me and said, "Hey, I asked ChatGPT. This is in like April 23, so this is pretty early on. I asked you who is a big critic of Lex Friedman, and it says you. So can you? It's telling me about all these articles you've written. Could you just like send me them because I can't seem to find them online?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's because they don't exist." And this is where I basically started to think about. Not just hallucinations of LLMs, but hallucitations, because they're just dreaming up citations. But yeah, this was kind of, we've seen so much happen from this period. It's kind of like enormous sort of cultural learning curve around these technologies, which supposedly can do anything and are close to becoming, AGI. And yet, as we saw in a study that came out this week, if you ask them a set of any LLM questions around, what's going on in the world, it's going to get it wrong 60% of the time. Right. So this is the precarity of the information ecosystem in which we live, and I think a growing epistemic collapse around not just, what is potentially deep fake, but what is, shallow true. Like, how do you figure out, like, which is which right now? Right. And we're losing that sense of collective knowledge, which is why I'm loving that, Ruha is talking about this is history. We have to talk about our history. We have to center in our history because it is being taken away from us. Right. We are being told an alternative history right now by the US government. Right. And we have to start telling our own stories loudly.
Right. And that, I think, is a nice sort of segue to the specter of AGI, which goes along with these lovely robot images that Ruha has shared with us. And we want to talk about policy briefly and then imagination and sort of figure out where we go from here. But one thing I think that large language models just came up sort of for the first time here as the sort of centerpiece in certain ways of generative AI, or at least the programs that we know best. But it's worth saying, right, that, again, the sort of multiplicity of AIs that are out there, and an algorithm or a machine learning model for in a lab that's trying to create new proteins or drugs. And we've seen these sort of positive stories of, speeds up the scientific method. That's a hard thing to be mad at. That there's ways in which these so-called AIs are doing remarkable things. There's also all this scary stuff. Let's talk about robots and AGI. Ruha, you gave us these excellent robot images. Talk to us about the specter of the robot in history and now, speaking of history.
Let's start with the word robot, thinking about its origin and etymology, drawn from the Slav robota, which means servitude, hardship. And so, anytime we're talking about robots in pop culture, in my view, it's a way to channel our anxieties about human dehumanization. So it becomes this kind of proxy for thinking about all of the ways that human labor and human agency is diminished. And that, in my view, there's 2 stories that we're routinely told about robots, emerging technologies more broadly. The first, is that dystopian story. They're here to slay us, right? They're going to take all the jobs. They're going to rob us of our agency, everything bad associated with technology. And really, that's the narrative that Hollywood loves to sell us. The Terminator, the Matrix, the list goes on. On the other hand, we have the techno-utopian narrative that everything good is associated with the progress, the future. It's going to make everything more efficient, less biased, more neutral, and this is the narrative that Silicon Valley, until very recently focused on selling us. And I think the thing that I really want to point out is that although on the surface these seem like opposing narratives, they have different endings to the story, right? One in which we're slayed, one in which we're saved. they share an underlying logic, what we would call a techno-deterministic logic, which is just a fancy way of saying that we assume that technology is in the driver's seat, propelled by a will of its own. But the human, going back to the first part of our conversation, humans behind the screen are missing from both of those scripts, right? All of those values, assumptions, desires. And so we have to pull back that screen, recenter the us that's actually monopolizing power and resources and imposing that vision onto those who are treated like automata. And you see the signs here that people are holding up, pushing back against the diminishment of their agency and their labor. This last one is from a walkout in St. Paul, Minnesota at Amazon warehouses. And again, we are humans, not robots, as this refrain, this mantra, recognizing, if you can't stop work to pee, you can't call in sick, you go home with your limbs aching, that's a way of really pushing back, the slogan, pushing back against that diminishment. And so again, I use the image of robot and I bring these slogans for us to really think about what is behind that term, what's behind the slogan, to think about the layers of labors that make AI appear magical, whether it's content moderators in the Philippines, whether it's click workers in Kenya, whether it's Amazon workers down the street. Part of it is pulling back the screen and reckoning with what some people call artificial intelligence, that do the ghost work that makes AI appear magical. And then it brings us back to us.
And I think it was actually Jeff Bezos who even called it artificial intelligence when he created Mechanical Turk. And I'm so glad that you brought this image in, Ruha, because it really reminds me of one of the experiences, the first Amazon fulfillment center that I ever went to in New Jersey. The thing that really struck me was just the amount of bandages that people had, like the repetitive strain of bending down to pick up objects and put them in boxes, and just the amount of physical pain that was on display. And then, these big whiteboards that said, we want to hear your voice, share things here. And, people were asking things like, why can't I get a day off around Thanksgiving? And it wasn't changing anything. It was this kind of broken feedback loop. But you were just seeing sort of, again, in really sharp contrast, just how difficult this is as a place of labor.
Some warehouses have these phone booth size, or we might say coffin size booths called Amazon, that you can enter and smell lavender and have a meditation going and some very calming images. And I think about that Amazon, how it's not just in Amazon, but there's so many of our workplaces that have a corollary to that sort of, mental fix, mental health fix, wellness fix that doesn't get at the underlying conditions that people are actually working in.
Right. And this, I love that, as you point out, and as you just did, the idea of the robot long predated, right, the idea that we could actually sort of have these servile machines, right? Not unlike the idea of the zombie or the sort of automaton. So these mythologies run deep. If we could turn briefly to the world of policy and this frightening gathering that Kate just returned from in Paris. You said you had to sleep a week to recover.
I need to recover, this was tough.
You've revived. Thank you for reviving and being with us. I want to talk about policy and then the sort of where do we go from here and the imagination moment of this conversation. But one line that I've sort of returned to and sort of thought about in thinking about this gathering and this image, right? People who think about geopolitics these days, I've heard people say this, that data's the new oil. Like this is what nation states covet. Metadata of people, whether it's at the border and sort of being able to track and know and ascertain and recognize. The data has become vastly important to our politics. But tell us, Kate, if you could, about what happened in Paris a couple weeks ago. People saw J.D. Vance say what he said. There was this moment about accelerationism, deregulation. AI's the thing, let's go, And the U.S. didn't sign on to whatever resolution, big surprise, about sustainability, et cetera. But talk to us about what you experienced and saw there.
Yeah.
among the powers that be.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for people who don't know this image, this is from the President Macron's AI Action Summit, which is the 3rd international summit on artificial intelligence. We've had summits at Bletchley Park in the UK and in South Korea. And each one of these summits sort of concluded with a statement looking at the potential risks of AI and how to address that internationally, creating a sort of a thin but present kind of connective tissue across nation states to acknowledge that there are downsides of these technologies. So we all, sort of went along to this summit, and they sort of invite heads of state and some, academics and, some CEOs and whatnot, and sort of pile us into a room. And the big question is, what are the resolutions? Like, what is the state of understanding risk, which of course has gone up and up and up just in the last 24 months. And Macron gave a speech on the first day saying, thanks for being here. I've just raised 109 billion EU to make France the center of AI for Europe. And thanks for coming to my party.
It's going to be a good one. I hope
yeah,
it was
so it was.
I hope it was a rager.
I mean, it was extraordinary. It was kind of like watching in game theory, like defection, when people say, "Hey, we could collaborate," or "I could just do what's good for me." And this began a cascading series of defections, where the U.S. did not refuse to sign, this potential agreement, which did mention climate change for the first time, which was great.
Right.
Then the UK didn't sign, and then there was this sort of scrambling around, interestingly, China did sign, saying, how do we think about labor and the environment in relation to AI? So the tables really flipped. But as in a moment of understanding where we are, this is it. We are going into this period of extreme AI acceleration. The removal of what small, tiny regulatory frameworks that we had around the tech sector, and then a pouring of petrol on the fire of a vast amount of capital. So this was that moment.
It was a big fire.
It was really, for those of us who've been looking at AI risks and harms and the bigger picture of what these technologies do to our social systems, our political systems, our environmental systems, it was really horrifying because no one's coming to save us. We can't look to government structures to solve this. In fact, in many ways, they're actually taking us back. So if change isn't going to come from above, it has to come from below. And we have to think about how that is going to happen, because we're not just pushing back on algorithmic decision-making at the border or in the policing systems. I'm thinking here of American artists' amazing work around sort of security theater and the use of everything from facial recognition to predictive policing data. But we now have to think about our water supply. We have to think about what's happening to the energy crisis. And these are things that communities can push back on. Yeah. We have to remember that. We have a history that we can turn to that does remind us that change is possible.
Precisely because it's not on a cloud somewhere. It's in actual places where people live and work and exist and so on. This slide we're going to skip over very quickly because it's kind of a post-mortem. This document is kind of dead, I'm sorry to say.
It's gone.
It's gone. But the reason I think it bears sort of mentioning is that, some very brilliant people worked on this thing in the last administration, at least Alondra Nelson, your colleague at Princeton, Ruha. And she, of course, talks about the ways in which all these things that we need to think about in terms of transparency, in terms of discrimination, in terms of how we can engage and think about AIs that could be emancipatory or could be tools for good or for equity. But she also said something I think seems so important, which is that so much of AI policy is sort of focused on bad actors and what if the Chinese get these chips, or what if the AI itself becomes a bad actor, without focusing on what you've focused on so much in your work, both of you, the ways in which extant sort of systems or AIs that are doing what they're supposed to do reinforce extant systems, the world as it is, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the, sort of takeaways thinking about this AI Bill of Rights is how hard it is to create something and how easy it is to destroy something, like in terms of just time scale, energy, investment. And so, we think about, I've written about sort of abolition as it relates to technology, and that word often evokes the destroying part. But really, that abulere, the growing, what do we want to foster and cultivate? It takes so much more work and wisdom to be able to create something as my colleagues did, and in a stroke of a pen, destroy. And so that's partly an invitation for us to think about how we place our limited energies, our little lifetimes that we have here. How do we want to spend it? What do we want to invest it in terms of those twin processes?
And we've arrived at imagination.
Yeah.
Right on cue.
Yes.
And these words from another mighty writer,
Yeah.
Toni Morrison: as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think.
Yeah.
Those words are important to you. Tell us why.
Yeah, train as a scholar, research, this enlightenment model of what we need. And, I started coming to the conclusion many years ago that the facts alone aren't going to save us. Creating more and more data about things that we know a lot about already, And so in some ways, constantly seeking data for things and to prove this or that, it becomes in some ways a placeholder for acting on what we already know, right? So the critique, a mass of data, but thinking about how to actually infuse that in our actions, in our work, in our world building. And this sort of invitation is really important for me as an educator as I think about how to scaffold knowledge production, where to place our energies, as I was mentioning before, and really taking imagination seriously. Not as flights of fancy, not as something only for self-proclaimed artists, not as something that necessarily can fit in the context of an exhibit, but all of the forms of imagination that happen even in the mundane things, like in a spreadsheet, right? In a budget. Organizers often call, budgets moral documents because they tell us who and what we value. So looking for imagination in unexpected places, but also inviting ourselves to exercise imagination, even if we don't think of ourselves as a creative or as an artist. Because in my view, that's part of the world building that Butler did. When you go to the Huntington and you see, her papers, she was studying newspapers, she was studying medical anthropology, she was doing so much research and then deciding to present it in the form of narrative and fiction, on the one hand. But she was also doing a lot in the margins in terms of dreaming before we think, in that, she was fashioning and creating her own life. There's so many aspects of the exhibit here that just remind me, the fact that she has this phrase that she would write her marginalia, a note to herself. So be it, see to it. A mantra that's almost willing into being what she wanted to manifest in the world. She was writing herself into existence. She was saying well before anyone acknowledged her brilliance, I'm gonna be a New York Times bestseller, boom, boom, boom. So be it, see to it. I'm going to be able to buy my dream house. So be it, see to it. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And it's that kind of conjuring and imagination and creativity that happens, yes, on the individual level, as she did, but I think we have to also channel that sort of willingness in our collective work, in our world building, in our organizing, in our movement efforts, to really step back sometimes and think beyond the strategies that we need to get those short-term goals, which are important, but really to center vision, that bigger vision that we're trying to conjure and manifest in terms of our shared futures.
Quite beautifully put. And as you've also written, Ruha, that we're a pattern-seeking species, right? And it's such a necessity right now to sort of create new patterns, right? And sort of, I think as you've also put it, right, ideas like race were nothing if not the act of imagination of a sort of mad French scientist in the 1700s, right? So all of these things come from imagination, the good and bad. Exactly. Not just the good, the bad too. But speaking of, this is because you speak so eloquently to this, you have a little exercise or some sort of words for us to imagine a future we feel good about. Do I hit play?
Not yet.
How do we do it? Okay, you got it.
Just go back to the words.
All right, I'm going back.
So, part of it is that, imagination is something we have to exercise. It's a muscle. We have to, strengthen it. We have to be like, training that thing. And so part of it is, again, not to think of it as so mystically, but how do we actually practice this form of looking beyond the horizon of what's right in front of us, whether that's 4 years of a certain administration or whether that's longer time scales. And so this is a little exercise, again, just to open up that space that you'll fill, in conversation afterwards, hopefully. But we're gonna split the room in half, and we're gonna say, this side of the room, your catchphrase is be bold, all right? So when I point to you, you're gonna shout it in unison like you're trying to shoot me like a rocket in the sky, all right? You ready? Be bold! Excellent. This side of the room, your catchphrase is get real. And I want you to say it like a very bored teenager, all right? And the more obnoxious, the better. Ready? Space travel, free public transportation, colonize Mars, decolonize Earth, AI superintelligence, cancel student debt, build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse, build affordable housing for all, spend billions on weapons and war, invest in peace and well-being for all. You get the picture. Now we can do the picture. And so it's this idea, that boldness is rationed while realism is mass-produced. And that we're trapped in many ways inside this lopsided imagination of those who are monopolizing power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. And those futurists, that astronaut on the pool, now they let their own imaginations run wild. It's not that they don't have imagination, they have an excess of imagination that they're materializing, bending our physical and digital realities, and their visions, our visions even, grow limp when it comes to, thinking about a world in which everyone has what they need to thrive. And so the invitation is for us to be bold when it comes to our social vision, and to reclaim that power, and to, expel those colonizers of our imagination that make one set of goals seem feasible that are really far-fetched and sci-fi, and really reclaim the possibilities for what we're constantly told are impossible. Going back to Butler, I guess the last thing I'll say, I have this little quote of hers on my office door, and on the wall, and it says, we can, each of us, do the impossible if we can convince ourselves it's been done before. And that's why that historical imagination, to think about what many of our ancestors were able to conjure that seemed impossible in their lifetimes, and yet they woke up and they did their part, whether it was small or big. And it's channeling that historical stubbornness that we want to infuse in our own work to keep us going in this moment.
Beautiful way to sort of bring this conversation
Yes.
to a close.
Hallelujah.
We're a species who's been in awful spots before, many, many times, and just reminding ourselves of that and what we've done, and as you've helped us do, to remember that we have done the impossible is important. I promised Kate no more of her tweets, but this one I loved so much because Laurie Anderson has performed here.
I love this because this is the equivalent of putting it on my office door, except I just had to share it with them because Laurie Anderson, huge influence on me as a baby electronic musician in my
Love
teens.
this part of your past. Yeah.
She was absolutely changed my thinking about what sound and music could be. And then she says this perfect thing that completely encapsulates the problem, which is that if you think technology is going to solve your problems, you don't understand technology and you don't understand your problems. I just think it's absolutely so perfect because exactly as Ruha is saying, we are misdiagnosing what technology can do and we are misdiagnosing what we can do. Yes. And the power is with us. Yes. that, I think, is almost more than anything at this time, is like, how are we going to remember what the us is in this phrase? And rather than the AI always being centered, always coming first, that we are going to have to start asking harder questions around who technology is serving and whose interests is it advancing. And I know things feel really bleak, they do in our world. We were chatting before about, the collapse that's coming in the American university system. And it feels like the end of the world. We've seen the US depart the Paris Agreement. We've seen the end of the Bill of Rights, things that many people in this room have worked really hard for. But the thing that I always keep coming back to is that the world has ended many times. And we have to remake it. But we have to remake it not by putting technology at the center and saying, how can it drive us forward? But by flipping the question and saying, what kind of world do we want to live in? And how does technology serve that vision, not drive it? That's the big one, I think, for me, in terms of how we go through this moment. And just to end you on possibly one of the most dystopian things that I was reminded of recently, and then we'll get back to a hearty bit of poetry. But, thinking about the end of the world, Sam Altman apparently said, AI might bring about the end of the world, but in the meantime, we'll have some pretty great companies. I kid you not. And what I would like to suggest is that is not the vision that Ruha and I are suggesting that we ground ourselves in right now, and that we are facing real collective threats, both human-made and of the planet right now, and we are only going to solve them by thinking about how we want to remake the world after the end of the world.
Yeah, Ashe. And I will just footnote to that is, although we're three individuals sitting here on this stage talking about this, pragmatically speaking, this really involves us plugging into the organizations and movements that are flowering in many different locales and regions. And so this isn't, kind of like individual brain power genius that's going to move us forward, but it's really plugging into these all kinds of, whether it's Take Back Tech, which is a wonderful initiative. I went to their conference last summer. So many local organizations, probably many of you in here are working with, but there's ways to plug in to sort of channel the despair, to channel the rage, to metabolize it through action and through community. And so again, moving beyond the kind of individual model of, leaders and change, to really plug into all of the resources that we have around us to be able to do this.
Beautiful. It just remains for me to thank the brilliant Ruha Benjamin, Kate Crawford, for taking a deep breath with us, for sharing your knowledge, your vision.